I'm John Norton. Some people worry about the militarization of police agencies today as tactical units, automatic weapons, body armor, and armored vehicles called MRAPs proliferate to cities across the nation. A noted scholar who will appear at ISU says that's really nothing new. Julian Go is the Bone Lecturer this year. Coming up March 28th at ISU, the University of Chicago professor is the author of the book, Policing Empires, Race, Imperialism, and Militarization in the U.S. and Great Britain. In this interview with WGLT's Charlie Schlenker, Go says the militarization of law enforcement has been going on since the dawn of modern policing.
The real first modern police department is the London Metropolitan Police in 1829. And this is the model of the civil police, as it was called, that then the United States emulated. Before this, we didn't have police departments. You had watchmen, often volunteer. You had constables, and they were all separated locally. They didn't really have any organization. And so this idea of a modern police department that we live with today, that we have, it just didn't exist in the 19th century until the London Metropolitan Police. What you had was the first full-time police officers in a single centralized department. And what made it militaristic was the founders of this department decided to copy these military colonial police forces, particularly in Ireland and elsewhere. The police suddenly were uniformed or were hierarchically organized under officers, like sergeants. That title was borrowed from the military. And militarization doesn't just mean that you borrow military weapons. It's the whole organizational copying and culture and mindset.
You've talked about successive waves of militarization, though. How did it progress?
Over time, there are these moments when the police turn to military and colonial and imperial forms, and what's borrowed kind of varies depending on what's available at the time. But in the big picture, you've seen an accumulation of militarization.
You call this an effect of the imperial boomerang. Unpack that, would you?
Yeah, so when these police look to the military, they're specifically copying forms that were occurring in the colonies, in Ireland, in the Caribbean, in the United States in the early 20th century would be U.S. colonial Philippines. These are forces that have been developed to control populations, colonial populations, to not only prevent crime, but also more particularly to prevent insurgency and rebellion. So by boomerang, we go abroad to conquer new colonies and new lands and occupy them, and then it comes back, right, in the form of these militarized ways of dealing with population. And so what we do abroad in colonial sites and the peripheries of empire, such as in Vietnam, these tactics and forms that are developed for those sites then return back and are used on domestic population by the police.
How did this pattern become inflected in the case of slavery and post-slavery?
In slavery, what the police did was they borrowed from and imitated certain things of the slave patrols. The slave patrols were in the American South and the British Caribbean, and these were essentially forms of policing. Just to take one example, when the London Metropolitan Police were created, they copied the slave patrols system called the beat system. Some people might know about the police beat system, where you have an officer walking around a certain neighborhood, a territorially defined area. The London Metropolitan Police copied that from the slave patrols, which also had their own distinct beats, right? They would cover certain territories near and around the plantation, and they would make sure that the slaves were under control. They would inspect slave dwellings for weaponry. They would make sure slaves weren't having mass meetings. This kind of territorial-based control was a crucial part of the slave patrol. And these police officials, when they created police departments, copied that kind of style.
You're also writing that each wave has been triggered by the racialization of crime and disorder. Race and imperialism are intertwined, but not necessarily the same thing. So where's the nuance there?
Race and imperialism are not the same thing, but imperialism and colonialism nearly everywhere, particularly in the cases of the U.S. and Britain that we're talking about. Imperialism and colonialism were always justified on racial grounds. The justification for conquering the Philippines and for the United States ruling them, for example, the justification for the British ruling India, and so on and so on. It was always that these peoples are racially inferior. They need the control and regulations by their supposedly superior white race. And so similarly, when historically the police have adopted from these colonial forms, when the imperial boomerang, in a sense, comes back, the justification was typically, well, we need these militarized forms of control. We need these weaponry to deal with the savages in our midst, in our streets. So there was a racialized language there too.
How did the racialization of the anti-immigration movement in the late 1890s through the 1930s inflect policing in America?
All of these immigrants, of course, are coming over in the U.S. There's mass migration. And it's not only immigration from, say, Europe, it's also mass migration of African Americans from the South to the North cities. It's in the West, Asian populations moving around towards the cities. And what this created was a fear of crime among white populations in these cities that, oh, these immigrants and these migrants are coming and they're creating all this crime. It's a familiar narrative and rhetoric that we know from discussions of immigration today. And it struck fear into these officials. And then they then said, well, okay, well, we got to deal with this. How are we going to deal with this? Well, we have to strengthen policing. And the way they thought to strengthen policing was turning to the methods and tactics that had been developed overseas to do with the colonized people overseas. The racialization, as we sociologists call it, the racialization of crime and disorder, where you think about crime and disorder as coming from particular racialized groups, in this case, immigrants and migrants, that then justifies bringing the boomerang home and justifies the police adopting these military forms and tactics. And that's exactly what so many police departments did in the early 20th century. They created some training programs, copied after the military. They adopted military techniques such as pin mapping to identify insurgents overseas, and they adopted that for crime, and a whole series of basically copying what the military were doing overseas.
Today we're having debates about how prevalent automatic weapons should be among police forces, or whether police forces should have what amounts to tactical vehicles or semi-armored vehicles. Where does the arc of this level out or decline?
There was criticism of local police departments getting surplus military equipment. During the Clinton era, especially and up through basically 2016, basically up through Obama, there was a policy called the 1033 program by which local police departments could get military surplus equipment. So they get these MRAPs, they get all these grenade launchers and all this equipment. And that was a consistent practice. But there have been criticisms, in fact, both from the left and from the right. The Republican Senator Rand Paul criticized this in 2015 onward. Other folks, of course, the Democrats didn't like it. And so there have been criticisms. There have been bills introduced to stop this program. There have been attempts to stop this. Part of the problem is that the police already have all this equipment, right? So stopping future transfer is one thing, but actually there's no talk about removing what the police already have gotten over the past decades.
That is Julian Go, this year's Robert Bone Distinguished Lecturer. He's the author of Policing Empires, Militarization, Race, and the Imperial Boomerang in Britain and the U.S. The speech will be March 28th. He spoke with WGLT's Charlie Schlenker.